Let's dive into one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. It's the story of a group of people who tried everything they could to escape the world, but in doing so, they ended up becoming some of its most powerful and influential players. Yeah, we're talking about medieval monks. So, when you picture a medieval monk, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What was their actual, day-to-day job? It seems like a pretty simple question, right? But the answer is probably not what you're thinking. For most of us, this is the image. You see this quiet, scholarly guy hunched over a desk with a quill, carefully copying some ancient book. We think of them as the guardians of civilization, the librarians of the Dark Ages. And look, they definitely did that. But that's not the whole story. In fact, it's not even close to their real purpose. Yeah, that whole preserving classical knowledge thing, it wasn't on their mission statement. It was more of a side effect, a really, really fortunate accident of what their actual job was. Their true purpose was something way more focused and, to the medieval mind, infinitely more important. Okay, so what was it? A monk's job, first and foremost, was to pray. Their entire existence was built around renouncing the world, all of its temptations, its politics, its noise, so they could achieve a state of spiritual purity. Why? Because that purity was believed to make their prayers as powerful as possible. And this is where we get to the central paradox, the really weird part. The harder the monks tried to disconnect from society, the more desperately society needed them. Withdrawing from the world didn't make them irrelevant. No, it made them absolutely essential. As the historian Paul Friedman puts it so brilliantly, the world just would not leave them alone. Their attempt to escape was a spectacular failure, because the very act of escaping gave them something the world was desperate to get its hands on. The thinking back then was actually pretty simple. Worldly stuff, power, money, fighting, it corrupts you. So a monk who was totally removed from all that, well, he was seen as spiritually clean. And a clean line to God meant your prayers just had more juice, more power. Their distance was their strength. Probably the best way to think about it is this. A monastery was kind of like a spiritual power plant. Through their nonstop, super disciplined prayer and self-denial, they were generating this massive surplus of spiritual grace. Way, way more than they needed for their own salvation. They were like the Persian Gulf of prayer, just sitting on these huge reserves of spiritual capital. So what do you do with all that surplus spiritual energy? Well, it gets distributed. And this is what created a kind of spiritual economy, a trade agreement between the holy guys inside the monastery walls and the very unholy guys running the world outside. To get why this trade was so important, you have to picture the world back then. The post-Roman era was a mess. It was violent. It was chaotic. The people in charge, the kings, the knights, the warlords, were often just thugs who built their power on pure bloodshed. So they were rich, they were powerful, but they were also deeply, deeply anxious about what was going to happen to their souls. And all that anxiety created a market for something called intercession. This is the key. Intercession is just the belief that a holy person, like a monk, can pray for you, that they can go to God on your behalf and act as a sort of spiritual lawyer for your sinful soul. This set up a perfect symbiotic cycle. A warlord goes out, cracks some skulls, and gets a ton of power and wealth. But all that violence makes him really worried about going to hell. So, to ease his conscience, he donates a huge chunk of his loot to a monastery. And in return, the monks dip into their spiritual bank account and pray for his soul. It was a perfect deal between powerful sinners and professional saints. But this system, relying on individual holy men, it wasn't very scalable. For monasticism to become a real force across the continent, it needed to get organized. It needed discipline. It needed a revolution. I mean, the first monks were basically spiritual superheroes. You had guys like Saint Simeon Stylites who proved how holy he was by living on top of a tiny pillar for 35 years, which is incredible, for sure, but you can't exactly build a franchise around that model. It was just too extreme, too individual. So you ended up with these two competing models. You had the Desert Hermit way, which was heroic, but totally unpredictable and almost impossible to copy. And then you had this new model, the Benedictine one, which was moderate, communal, and designed to be reproduced over and over again. It was less about individual stars and more about the power of the team. The blueprint for this whole revolution was the Rule of Saint Benedict. You can think of it as a practical how-to guide for running a monastery. And its genius was that it shifted the focus. Power didn't come from extreme acts anymore. It came from the complete surrender of your own ego to the group through obedience, humility, and constant synchronized group prayer. And because this new model was so moderate and so well structured, you could basically copy and paste it all over Europe. This is what allowed for the explosion of thousands of monasteries, all running on the same successful spiritual business plan. Which brings us right back to where we started. We know their real job was to pray, and we know how that made them so powerful. So, let's solve the final piece of the puzzle. How did these prayer factories accidentally become the great libraries of Western civilization? First, let's just be crystal clear about this. The Rule of St. Benedict, that brilliant manual we just talked about, it never says, hey guys, go copy a bunch of books to preserve civilization. That was not part of the mission. The goal was salvation, not scholarship. But, and this is the key, their primary role accidentally created the perfect conditions for scholarship to just happen. The first ingredient was literacy. The rule required monks to read holy texts. In a world where almost nobody could read, this one simple rule turned monasteries into islands of literacy. The second ingredient? Time. By being walled off from the chaos of the world, monks were free from the daily grind. This gave them the incredible luxury of long, quiet, uninterrupted hours, exactly what you need for demanding work like copying manuscripts. And the third, absolutely crucial ingredient was wealth. Remember all those rich warlords donating land and money? That made monasteries incredibly rich. They had the cash to go out and buy rare books and afford expensive materials, like parchment, which was super pricey back then. And that's it. That's the solution to the paradox. It wasn't some grand mission that made monks the keepers of knowledge. It was the accidental combination of these three things: literacy, time, and wealth, all of which were just byproducts of their real job, praying for the very world they had tried so hard to leave behind. It's wild to think about. The monks found this immense power by disconnecting. They created incredible value through withdrawal and through silence. And it leaves us with a pretty big question for our own time, for our own age of hyperconnectivity. If they built so much by pulling away from their world, what are we building by plugging so intensely into ours?